Now, Russian forces appear to be advancing as they step up their attacks across the east of Ukraine. Fighting has reached the outskirts of the strategically important city of Severodonetsk. President Zelensky has described conditions in the region as extremely difficult. Russia has said it will allow ships carrying food out of blockaded ports in the south of the country, but only if sanctions are lifted. Earlier, I spoke to retired four-star general and former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Wes Clark, and I began by asking him how he sees this conflict progressing.
You have to look at this conflict through multiple dimensions. There's the military dimension on the ground, there's the diplomatic, and there's the informational. On the military situation, Russia achieved some early, easy success in the south. It hasn't been able to go far with that, but it's significant. It's captured an oblast in the south and eliminated the defenders at Mariupol. This gives it the diplomatic advantage of having bargaining power in any ceasefire. In addition, the various groups in the United States and Europe are behaving exactly as the Russians predicted, that there would be perhaps shock if there was an initial action, but soon the economic interests, the fears of nuclear escalation, the general disinclination to engage in conflict would undercut Western resolve and lead to pressure for a ceasefire in place, after which Russia can gain an informational advantage by casting Ukraine as the party that wants to continue the war and by concealing its crimes and building up its forces in its occupied territories that are part of Ukraine.
We're already seeing Russia saying that it will allow ships carrying food out of this blockade of the southern ports, which is having a really significant effect on global food supplies. But Russia is saying it's only going to do that if sanctions are lifted. I mean, that sounds a bit like blackmail, doesn't it?
From start to finish, this operation has been about blackmail in an attempt to isolate and eradicate Ukraine. That's the Russian objective. And some people believe that as long as there's one country between them and Russia, they're safe. It's what I hear from and have heard from years of dialogue in Europe. Yes, these Russians, they're certainly not like us. We don't want to be living like they do, but we can do business with them. Well, can we do business with a rogue government that launches an unprovoked attack, engages in the most massive ethnic cleansing we've seen in Europe since World War II, torture, rape as an instrument of policy, Russification? These are the very things that the European Union and Western democracies stand against. And yet, I hear the rumblings of, well, we must have Russian oil and gas. We'll pay in rubles. Or people saying, we must take into account that Russia's an important country. We should encourage the Ukrainians to give up their territory. This is what Putin anticipated when he began this operation. So the way through this is give Ukraine the armaments, logistics, munitions, support it needs. Let the Ukrainians fight and regain their territory. Let Russia peacefully withdraw, and then we'll settle up on the accountability of the trillion-dollar destruction of Ukraine and thousands of war crimes that have been executed by the Russians. This is really a battle that's about the future of the world system.
General Clark, we've heard Ukraine's ambassador to the UK saying that he would like NATO to get directly involved to break that blockade of southern ports, instead of giving into this demand from Russia for sanctions to be lifted, saying that there should be military action against that blockade of the southern ports, which is disrupting vital supplies to so many countries? Do you think NATO should be prepared to do that?
I think the United Nations should create a coalition of the willing to do that.
And do you think that that is a realistic possibility now?
I think that the longer it goes on, the more realistic the possibility is, yes.
Do you think NATO was perhaps too cautious at the start of this invasion, that it shouldn't have made it so clear to President Putin that it was not going to confront him militarily, that to an extent gave him the idea that he could get away with seizing parts, at least, of Ukraine?
I don't think NATO was excessively cautious. I think NATO came together in a remarkable way, in a way that Mr. Putin didn't calculate. But had we asked for a no-fly zone in those early weeks in the year, in January and early February at the United Nations, it probably could have been established, and it might have been able to deter a Russian invasion. It's simply a fact that nations didn't think of it and didn't ask for it. And in part, that was because so many nations didn't believe the intelligence that was being presented.
We've seen some signs of significant dissent within Russia, despite President Putin's brutal crackdown on anyone who objects to what he's doing in Ukraine. A Russian diplomat at the UN in Geneva has resigned and so on. Do you think there is any chance that senior figures within Russia could turn against President Putin, given the loss of life on the battlefield and the isolation which Russia is now facing?
Of course, senior officials in his government are aware of these factors. The question is whether they have the will to take action. And that depends on factors we simply can't know here.
Is there any more, do you think, that the West could legitimately do to stop Putin, to remove Putin? I know the West is not going to itself inflict regime change, but is there some way or something more that the West could and should be doing now to try to bring about a change of course by Russia?
Well, I wouldn't advocate regime change as a way of changing course of Russia. I would advocate supporting Ukraine, strengthening sanctions, and using international institutions to put pressure on Russia and continue its isolation. The way this ends successfully is by convincing Putin he can't win, starting on the battlefield and then continuing into the diplomatic and informational spaces. If that's done, he will withdraw.
And just finally, President Zelensky himself has acknowledged that this conflict can only be brought to an end through negotiation ultimately. We've had figures such as Henry Kissinger suggesting that ultimately Ukraine will have to sacrifice some territory in order to find a peaceful solution. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that it's premature and improper to speculate on what it might take to bring an end to the conflict through diplomacy, because Ukraine has said that they will not engage in diplomacy except through the recovery of their territory. And I think it's improper to tell Ukraine that it must surrender its territory in order to appease Western appetites for fuel, gas, and return to normalcy. The whole concept of the rules-based international order, starting with the United Nations, is a concept of collective security, that the world would unite against an aggressor in order to prevent aggression or roll it back if it occurs. Why is Russia exempt from following international law? That's the fundamental question that has to be asked. So I would cast it this way. I think in order to end the conflict, Russia has to agree to abide by international law and withdraw.